thank you for sticking around. I'm Godfrey, as you just heard, and this is me on the internet. So you can find me on Twitter or on GitHub as Chan Can Code. Most of you probably don't know who I am, so I guess I'll tell you a little bit about myself before I start. So first of all, I'm a Canadian. Yeah, I'm sorry. I co-founded a consulting agency in Vancouver called Real Software. In fact, they actually paid for my trip up here, so you should thank them or thank the company. If you need help launching new product, or you need any Rails or JavaScript or design help, we can probably talk after this. And as you mentioned, I'm on the Rails core team, and I contribute to some other open source projects as well. Because I'm on the Rails core team, I actually work on Rails all the time. And this is a picture of me working on Rails yesterday. You can't really see Rails here because I'm sitting inside the train, but if you zoom in, you can see that there is actually another train there, and it says Canada, so hopefully you can infer that I'm in fact working on Rails. Anyway, I hope you like puns as much as I do. Otherwise, it's going to be very punishing for you. Right, and since you don't know me, you're probably wondering what qualifies me to speak here. I want to assure you that I have been through a lot of training and coaching to get to here. In fact, it took 4.5 hours worth of training to get here. If you haven't done it before, I highly recommend it. It's these are some of the pictures that I took on my way. So as you can see, on a nice day, it's really nice because it goes along the Pacific coast, and you get some beautiful scenery. And the best part is they even have Wi-Fi on the train, so you can actually get some work done while you take a train. If you go to the Amtrak website, they actually advertise this, so we can tell you that there's Wi-Fi on the train.
So that's all online training?
It's online training. 1 point for you, sir. But unfortunately, they don't explain this very well. They don't tell you what the colors on the map really mean, so I thought I would explain that to you a little bit. So as you can see, there's basically a line there, and above that line, that's Canada. Right? So you probably don't know this, but we're a very restricted country. So so the Wi-Fi doesn't actually work until you cross that line on the train, and they didn't tell you that ahead of time. I wish they did. But basically, yeah, so the yellow line is basically where the freedom begins. In your case, if you're taking the train up, that's where the freedom ends. Yeah, but it's not all bad. We basically traded our freedom for healthcare. So. Anyway, let's get into the talk. Before we begin, I hope you can see this clearly. I have almost 200 slides, so if you cannot see this clearly, you should probably find a better seat. Okay. If you're experiencing any fatigue or dizziness or double vision, you should probably call 911. But since you can all see this clearly, let's talk about fatigue. And specifically, I would like to talk to you about JavaScript framework fatigue. So a few months ago, my friend Alan Pike from Vancouver, he runs the JavaScript meetup there, but he wrote this blog post called JavaScript Framework on Ember Table. It's a pretty good read. You should find it on Google and read it yourself, but I'll quickly summarize it for you here. So basically, if you're a web developer and you don't recognize half of the things on the screen, then congratulations, you are probably just experienced a JavaScript framework. Or on the other hand, if you immediately know the answer to this, then you probably experience this JavaScript framework fatigue every day, and I genuinely feel very sorry. Unfortunately, that used to be me because I worked for a company that offered application monitoring service for front-end JavaScript applications. So, as you imagine having to support a new framework every 15 minutes or so does not make a very scalable business. To give you a perspective, here are some of the frameworks that reached 1.0 in like the last couple of years. Unfortunately, actually on the right there are some frameworks that haven't even reached 1.0, and at the bottom there's one framework that died before it made it to 1.0. It's a pretty sad story, but yes, that's Batman. So obviously this is not actually very useful because all the frameworks has different interpretations of what 1.0 actually means. I think Riot is something that's based on React, and React is currently at 0.15, so Riot's like some improved version of React or something. And then it's like hitting 2.0 or something very soon. I don't know how that works, but yeah, that's basically like 1.0 is pretty meaningless here. So I tried something else. So this is based on Google Trends. So basically, I just like set an arbitrary interest level or like arbitrary threshold on Google Trend, right? Like, and like this is the month that they first reach the critical mass of interest. Right? So this probably maps much closer to your mental model or your like when you might have first heard about each of these frameworks. And as you can see, these frameworks didn't get popular for no reason. Right? Like each of them generally brings some valuable new ideas to the table. So for example, at the left-hand side, there's the blue thing, that's Backbone. I guess at the time, the thing that you might use before that is Sprout Core, which is like cut off at the screen. So by comparison, Backbone is very minimalistic, and like the annotated sources, the annotated source code probably like it's like a few browser screens worth of like code. Right? So everyone that uses Backbone probably read that over like, a few times. So that's pretty interesting compared to the state of the art at the time. And then Knockout came about and probably introduced or at least popularized the idea of two-way bindings for front-end developers. And then there is Meteor, which promised to let you write the same code for your front end, like your client and your server. There's Angular, which encouraged you to write very reusable and composable things. And then there's React, which I guess it's like more functional approach to rendering and brings a lot of interesting technology to the table. So all of these things, they have something new to they have contributed some new ideas to like the grand table of front-end development. So if you are a person with a lot of free time, then this is an excellent time to be a front-end developer because you will never run out of things to learn. Or if you're running a consulting company, this might actually be good for a business. But unfortunately, if you have a real job and if you have a product to maintain, then all these new developments doesn't really benefit you that much, right? Like if you like started 2012 and then at the time Backbone was a thing, you pick Backbone and then all these things came about. Unless you decide to rewrite your project every 6 months, you're not going to get any of the new benefits from new things that came about, right? Even worse, even if you manage to resist the temptation of rewriting your app every 6 months, you'll keep hearing about the people around you raving about the new things and like the shiny new parts, and like you probably feel that I don't have time to learn about these. I don't know what they're talking about. I don't even know what I'm missing out, right? Like, and my app is probably now inferior in some ways that I don't even know about, and that gets very stressful and distracting. And that's basically what hype does to you. So Brandon Hayes did he's like some from the Ember community. He did a talk at RailsConf last year. I think that's a pretty great talk. You should look it up. But he did a talk recently at FluentConf, and I thought he summarized the whole thing pretty eloquently in the chart. Basically, when a new framework comes around, it probably solves an existing problem or a familiar problem in a new and interesting way, or it enables you to take on some old challenges in like much more easily. So perhaps you pick up this new thing and then you try to implement something that you were stuck on for the last 3 months, and it only took you a weekend to put together a prototype. And you're like, wow, if that thing that previously took me 3 months now takes a weekend, like imagine where it will be in like 3 months or half a year. Right? Fortunately, 6 months later, you begin to realize you're running into other problems. Perhaps you are spending a lot of time reinventing the tools that you used to have from your previous life in the other framework. For example, I thought we had the modal dialog problem solved like 10 years ago with jQuery UI, but for some reason we're all resolving modal dialogs with different frameworks every time something new comes out. Or perhaps sometimes some hard problems are just hard regardless of the tools that you use. Right? Having random things, managing global states, having random things on the page talk to each other is just like a hard problem regardless of how you do it. So regardless of the reason, this new tool that you picked up did not magically transform you into the 10x engineer that you hope to become. But that's not a problem though, because while you're focusing on rewriting your app with a new tool, you learned a dozen other new tools that have come up, so you can just pick a new one and start it. And that's basically the circuit that TypeScript runs on. So let's talk about an antidote to the hype fatigue problem. And I'm probably biased, but let's look at how Ember might help you with this problem. And if you have been around for a while, you've probably seen charts like this where Ember basically dominates the bottom end of the hype contest. So to a casual observer, it's actually pretty reasonable to arrive at the conclusion, like, isn't Ember dead? Why would you care? I will let you ponder on that for a moment, but I guess most of you use Ember, so but keep that in mind. It's like I think that's based on that, like it's a pretty reasonable thing for someone who haven't used Ember to be wondering about, right? Like you're gonna pick something, if you don't know any better, you probably pick the thing that's like, you know, highest on the chart, which happens to be Angular at this time. Probably because a lot of people are searching how to upgrade to Angular 2.0. Anyway, so let's look at some big bets that Ember made during its early days and throughout the process of its development that differentiates it from other frameworks. So my personal take on it is that Ember basically bets on 3 things. Like first, it decided to focus on ambitious web applications, and second, it was built with a lot of foresight into the upcoming web standards, and the third one is that it's really backwards compatibility is really important, and you need to move the entire community forward, and that's like stability without stagnation. And these 3 things, in my opinion, influence a lot of decisions in the framework's design, and consequently, also affected adoption of the framework. So for the rest of the talk, we'll basically look at each of these things and like use this lens to analyze Ember. So first of all, ambitious web applications. A lot of frameworks and libraries set out to solve the widget problem. For example, you might have a date picker on your website, right? That is not rocket science, but at the same time, it involves some non-trivial amount of state and code. Right? Like you need to click on it; it shows in the calendar. You can go to previous month, next month, or then maybe you can like select a year and jump to that year. Right? So it's desirable to encapsulate that logic somewhere, and that's basically what I refer to as a widget. And that's basically sometimes framed as solving the V problem in the MVC. And in fact, if you go to the React website, it tells you explicitly that a lot of people are using React for the V part of the MVC. That's great because every developer probably needs to solve the widget problem like many times, right? Like you probably have a lot of widgets on your website or on your app, regardless of the scale that you operate on. So this is great because you can quickly sprinkle some of the new knowledge that you learned from the new framework that you picked up, and immediately benefit from it. Because even if you're just building a sign-up form, you probably have a few widgets that you can encapsulate from there. And then from like what you learned, you can then extrapolate that knowledge into building an entire application out of the patterns you learned. By contrast, Ember sets out to provide a wholesale solution to the client-side application problem. So, in my opinion, that's like the difference is like a sign-up form versus something like SoundCloud or Discourse or Gmail or something like that, right? Where you basically have application with a lot of states on like loaded, and just so happens to be loaded in a web browser. So this approach actually came at a really high cost. So for one thing, it is a lot of work to do because you have to write a lot more code. It also means a much steeper learning curve, and that consequently restricts the pool of potential users that you could appeal to. On the other hand, focusing on the bigger problem will win you some very serious user. This is obviously only a very small subset of the people using Ember, and most of you are using Ember here. So you probably know this, but this gives you a pretty good idea of the scale that Ember operates on. Solving the application problem is probably easier said than done, though, because focusing on the big picture forces you to take on a lot of extra responsibilities that you can otherwise pass on to your users, right? For example, let's say you say solving the V in MVC is not good enough, so let's do like the whole MVC, right? But then you quickly realize MVC is just a component strategy or component architecture. For an application, you probably have a lot of these MVC things like showing up on the screen. Maybe they work alongside each other, or maybe you swap in and out, depend on the URL, for example. Right? So you need something to orchestrate them. So great, you add a router. But then, in order for the components to seamlessly work alongside each other, you need to have a single source of truth. So you add a data store in the mix, and then you realize, oh, now I have a great application, and I'm making money from this. I probably need to test that. So you need to think about testing as well. But then there's more, because you probably don't want to write your entire app in one JavaScript file, but for example, you probably need to have a build tool to build these things together, manage your assets. You probably want to have modules. You probably have to have a module loader. You probably want to have a development server. You probably want to have different build environment for development and for staging and test production. You probably want something to manage your configuration and all that stuff. But then that's not it, because your application is not very useful unless you can deploy them. So you also need to think about your deployment strategies. But then there's more, because you're not going to write all the code that you're going to use in your application. So you need a way for you to use other people's code and share your code with other people. Like, that's more complicated than just like loading a file, right? Like, because that needs to hook into stuff and so on, and you need to have a standard way to do that. Otherwise, that doesn't work very well. Of course, these hard problems are probably not that hard, or not that hard, because like besides the ecosystem part, everyone that like uses a library to build the app probably have to solve all these problems to some extent. Obviously, you can write an app in Angular or in React and deploy it. You know that can be done, right? So perhaps we should just say that focusing on like the applications angle forces you to solve a lot of real-world problems. Unfortunately, real-world problems are very boring, so they get a lot less spotlight attention than compared to, say, like inventing a new programming paradigm. After all, none of those things on the screen are exactly uncharted territories. So, in my opinion, in a lot of ways, this Ember dead sentiment feels a lot like when people say, "Oh, like Apple has stopped innovating." Right? Like, Retina display, that's like basically the same LCD display with more pixels, right? Like, yeah, sure, you have a pretty good camera on the phone, but then it's like 8 megapixels, not 15 megapixels. Or, well, okay, you have, like, they're basically making the same laptop, but they put a bigger battery in there, like, cool story. Why aren't they making, like, I don't know, augmented reality glasses or self-driving cars and stuff like that? Like, that's innovation. And, like, bigger battery in the laptop, not so much. So that's a pretty interesting to me, because a lot of times I think we tend to be carried away by the flashy new things rather than the boring stuff that actually makes or breaks our day-to-day experience. So with that said, let's look at some of the very boring non-innovations that Ember did to make your development experience a lot nicer. I'm going to go through these relatively quickly, since most of you are using Ember, but I guess this is like a recap of all the things that you're using. You're probably too used to it and you forgot about that. The first thing is the Ember Inspector. Similar to React or Angular's Inspector, you can have a list of, like, you get a tree view of your views, rendering performance, and so on. You can click any element, and then you can grab that component in the inspector, and you can change the properties. You can interact with them in the console and stuff. But because Ember is an application framework, you get to see a lot more from the inspector. For example, Ember has a built-in router that everyone uses the same router, right? So you can look at the router in the inspector, and you can look at the data store and see what models you have loaded and follow the relationship and stuff like that. Ember is able to do that in the inspector because, yeah, well, there's like the Ember router, and there's Ember Data that not everyone uses, but enough people uses to make it useful to have it in the inspector. Then that brings us to Ember Data. You probably know that you can have models and Ember Data, you can have attributes, and you can have relationships. That's probably not news to most of you. And then Ember Data is, of course, an identity store, so it helps you to keep the model, to manage the model while they're in memory. And you can specify where your data comes from. By default, it will soon be like a JSON API as the interchange format between your server and your client, so you don't have to think too much about like what goes on on the wire. But if that doesn't work for you for some reason, you can very easily swap that out and use your own adapter. So for example, you can use a RESTful API for most of things, and then you can use Firebase for users. And in fact, that doesn't even have to be an API if you're interested. For EmberConf, I wrote an app that basically parses the I can use HTML on the client and then turn that into, basically put that into the store. So you can look that up on YouTube, and yeah, that's Ember Data and Ember CLI, right? So Ember CLI is a little bit interesting because Ember CLI simultaneously, we use Ember CLI to refer to the tool, like the thing that you type in your command line to generate new Ember apps and stuff, but at the same time, it also refers to the baseline setup of that's like generated by Ember CLI, and probably the tooling ecosystem around it as well. So if you haven't seen it, it's basically like you can type Ember new test app and then generate an app for you, and it comes with a default file and folder structure. It has like Git set up for you for version control. It has the Babel ES6 module, the ES6 transpiler in there, a module loader, development server, test harness, asset pipeline, package management, JS hint, all the stuff built in, right? And the development server is probably a good example if you're not familiar with how Ember, like what the value of Ember CLI. So basically, out of the box, you type Ember serve, and it boots a development server for you. And every time you save a file, it automatically recompile only that file and or only what is necessary, and then build your entire app. Rebuild your entire app after, like every time you save it, and also it even live reload the tab you have open in the browser. So like probably before you have time to switch from your text editor to the browser, it already reloaded in there. And all of that is for comes absolutely for free, really. You don't have to configure anything to get that. Like that's the baseline that you get out of the box with Ember CLI. And same thing goes for testing. You have seen it earlier. So basically, every time you save or every time you generate anything from Ember CLI, it generates the test files for you as well. And you can run the test server, and every time you save a file, it like reloads them in the test runner and in the browser, which is very important because I think the most difficult part of testing is not usually figuring out how to test. It's like the most difficult part about testing is getting into the habit of doing it consistently. Like once you gone into habit, you would feel like, oh, okay, I need to write a test for the thing I'm working on, so like you would figure out how to test it. But if all of these things are like the test harness and stuff, that's like pretty difficult to set up, right? Like if I didn't get it for free and I'm working on a side project, I'm probably not caring not doing any of that. By building all of those right into the thing that everyone uses in the community, it actually, I suspect it probably have significantly increased the test coverage across the entire Ember community. So that's like a pretty powerful thing to have around. I've seen that. Okay, so all the generators and all the goodies that Ember CLI give you in the standard stack is pretty cool. But then, personally, I think the real breakthrough here is that we've finally achieved a conventional setup that everyone has. In turns, this make it possible for people to write add-on and hook into your app and assume a lot of things and make the experience actually useful. So for example, if you prefer writing CoffeeScript, you can run Ember install Ember CLI CoffeeScript. If you want to write Sass, oh, by the way, as an example, as soon as you run this, a few things happen. Whenever you generate anything from Ember CLI, it generates CoffeeScript files. So even your tests are now in CoffeeScript. I mentioned earlier, by default, Ember CLI has JS hints set up, right? So that basically links your code and tell you, like, oh, you probably should not write the code this way. There's a better way to do it. CoffeeScript requires something else other than JS hints, but because Ember CLI has JS hints built in, then people would expect any replacement to have something like that. Right? So Ember CLI CoffeeScript actually gives you, I don't know what that's called, but it gives you a different thing that provides the equivalent functionality of JS hints when you switch to CoffeeScript. So, right, so the same thing, you can do Ember install Ember CLI Sass to get Sass, or if you don't want to use QUnit, you want to use Mocha, you can do Ember install Ember CLI Mocha, and if you want code coverage, with Ember CLI Blanket. If you want to test on multiple browsers in the cloud, you have Ember CLI Sauce. If you want to use Firebase, there's Ember install Ember Fire. If you want authentication, there's Ember install Ember Simple Auth. If you want animations, there's Ember install Liquidfire. And if you think about deployments, you have Ember install Ember CLI deploy. And there are over 1,000 add-ons, like in around like half a year, or definitely less than a year of time. So on average, you're getting like almost free add-ons registered on npm every day. So that's pretty crazy. So in case you don't believe me, I tried to write an add-on so like it actually works. You can, if you want to write Canadian style sheets, you can run Ember install Ember CLI Canadian style sheets. Confusingly, the extension for both the usual CSS and Canadian style sheets they're both .css. But yeah, basically you can spell color correctly, and then you can be more polite when you have to like reach in and override someone's CSS rules. But anyway, so that's Ember CLI, right? Like that probably took me like a few hours in a weekend, and that gives you something that you can run one command and like automatically transpile some of your like CSS stuff. So in my opinion, like the baseline that Ember CLI sets is probably equally or even more important than any of the actual features that it provides. Okay, so we have the big perk. So that's the first big bad, and the second big bad is feature standard for sites. It helps to have some JavaScript thought leaders on your framework's core team. For example, if you don't know him, this is Yehuda Katz, who's on the Ember core team, but he's also on the TC49 committee, which is responsible for drafting the standard for the next version of JavaScript, essentially. He also used to be on the WFC technical architecture group, which is like focused on the larger web platform problem. But anyway, my point is, if you have someone that actively work on like what goes into the web platform in the future, you would expect that the core team would make decisions accordingly so that like they line up with what's going to happen in the future. Okay. And they do. One example is promises. It almost feels funny to describe promise as a future technology today, but it was some pretty cutting-edge stuff when they decided to go all in on promises like around I don't know 2 years ago. So, for example, this is how you define a route in Ember. You probably already know this. you can define a model hook, and if you return a promise from the model hook, it would be smart enough to like know that, oh, like I should wait for this promise to resolve before I continue to process this route. Or if the promise rejected, it would know that, oh, I should probably show an error page or something. Likewise, Ember Data uses promise for everything because fetching data from the server is obviously asynchronous. So you have store.find that returns a promise. And because Ember embraces promise across the stack, then it actually results in some pretty ergonomical API. So, for example, you would just return this .store.find and model hook, and then because the model hook expects a promise and the store returns a promise, they just work seamlessly. And likewise, Ember uses promises in testing as well, as you have seen earlier. So this is probably what you would have read to use promises for testing, because most of the UI interaction are asynchronous. So you have to like chain all the things with promises and return like more promises and the promises, and it gets pretty noisy, or like it even gets pretty tricky to reason about. But because Ember knows that everyone uses promises for the entire stack, it can cut away a lot of the noise for you and basically just queue up the promises for you, and you can get rid of a lot of the noise from the actual promise chain. And of course, there will be a promise tab in the Ember Inspector for more synergy points. Let's talk about one more example. So yeah, that was promises. And another example of Ember embracing future technology is web components. So if you're not familiar with them, web components is basically a set of future APIs for you to extend the browser by writing custom elements. Once again, it probably doesn't feel very cutting edge anymore, but just remember at a time when components were introduced in Ember, this is how you would have to explain them to your Angular friends, right? Like a directive that's restricted to any element names with an isolated scope that uses translation. And today, pretty much like everyone, or at least everyone in the Ember community has a pretty good, doesn't have a very hard time grasping the concept of a component. Yeah. And finally, there is ES6, which is the next version of JavaScript, or you might heard of it referred to ES 2015 and other names like that. But basically, it's some new additions to the JavaScript language that will come to the browser in the next year or two. One of the features in ES6 is modules, and in fact, Ember CLI apps has been using ES6 modules since day one, and for the last half a year or so, Ember CLI always has an ES6 transpiler built in. So actually, most of the Ember community has already been writing, taking advantage of these new JavaScript features for over half a year. So that's also a pretty powerful thing that you get by having something like Ember CLI and like a baseline for all the Ember apps. If you didn't have an Ember CLI which generates everything and set it up for you, a lot of people, myself included, would probably not even bother to set up something like Babel. So I wouldn't have time to figure out how to do that or what it is even. Whereas today you generate a new Ember app, and then you don't have to know about it because like it's backwards compatible, right? So you can write your normal JavaScript and it works, and then someday when you pair with someone, they can tell you, oh, like you can get rid of the function keyword there and it works, and then you try to save it and it works, and that's how you learn about these ES6 things, right? Like, and as a result, that's actually pushing the entire community forward, and that's a pretty cool thing. Skip that. Oh, actually, let's talk about it. So finally, ES6 also has classes. Finally, historically, Ember and pretty much every other framework has to ship their own class system because having to figure out how to inherit from things with prototypes is actually very tricky, and I don't even know if I could do it correctly if I have to. So ES6 solves that problem by providing you like a syntax to write classes, extend from other classes and stuff. So that's pretty awesome. You cannot use ES6 classes for Ember objects today, but work has already begun to reconcile the two. Presumably, eventually the Ember class system will go away once the standard supports like most of the features that you actually need. Conveniently, there is a TC39 member on the Ember core team, so that make things a little bit easier, and basically you can like have a pretty good understanding of what's more urgent and what's not urgent, and you can bring them to the standard community, and then from the standard community you can bring them back into the community. So if you're impatient, you don't even have to wait that long for the browsers to implement those things. Because Yehuda's proposal for JavaScript decorators have already been implemented in Bevel, you can actually start experimenting with the future syntax today. All you need to do is install Ember CLI computed decorators, and you can start using the new syntax. So it looks like this. Specifically, that line is the equivalent of calling that property first name, last name on your computed properties today. And yeah, so that's pretty cool because that's great for people who write the standard and for the community as well, because as soon as the thing is proposed, you can try it in your real apps with very minimal effort, and then you can find problems with that and feed it back into the standard, and the feedback loop is much tighter. All right, so the third big bet, stability without stagnation. As we have seen earlier, Ember has some very serious users, and as you can imagine, these users value stability very highly. It's not like these people actually rewrite the app every 6 months. So, but at the same time, you don't want this to be a baggage, right? Like you don't want to sacrifice implementing new features because you have a lot of craft that you build up over time. So to solve this problem, the Ember team has modeled the release after the Chrome browser, which means that in Ember, there are free release channels that you can subscribe to. There's Canary, which is nightly builds that contains the latest features. There's the beta channel, which drops roughly every week or so. And that's basically the candidates for the next stable release. And finally, there's the release channel, which is where you find the stable release that comes out every 6 weeks or so. Throughout the year, new features will land on the master branch of the repository, and that serves as a basis for the nightly Canary builds. All of these features are added behind a feature flag, and they can be toggled individually. And at the beginning of each beta cycle, the core team will basically review the features that are currently on Canary and decide which of them are stable enough to go into the beta release. Right, so those are the beta release. Because it's keynote now, we have to wait. Actually, I messed up my slides. Anyway, so these are the final releases. And I guess let's look at an example. So let's say handlebars 2.0 and HTML bars recently landed on master. And it's time for the 1.9 beta cycle. So the core team meet about and like, okay, look, these two looks pretty reasonable, so I guess we can put them into the 1.9 beta. So unfortunately, after a few beta cycles, it has been determined that there are still some edge cases in HTML bars that needs to be addressed. So it's not ready for production yet. But then it's fine because of these features of behind feature flags. You can very easily turn it off, and handlebars 2.0 can remain on the 1.9 beta, and while HTML bars can be turned off. So by the end of the beta cycle, you basically look at, oh, okay, handlebars is still on the last 1.9 beta, so that becomes the stable 1.9 release. At the same time, HTML bars has been reworked and the edge cases has been resolved, so it's time to give it an go on the 1.10 beta. Fortunately, this time it survived all the beta builds, and so it's ready for shipping in 1.10, the 1.10 release. So having a rolling release cycle like this, as opposed to piling a bunch of new stuff for like a year or so, actually makes it a lot easier for everyone. It's easier to upgrade your apps. It's easier to ship small incremental features, and you can benefit from the latest developments sooner. If you're not familiar with Ember, you might think, wow, that sucks. You have to upgrade your app every 6 weeks. But fortunately, that's where semantic versioning come in. So basically what this means is all the changes that we make during the 1.x series is supposed to be backwards compatible. So if you have a 1.3 app, in theory, you can upgrade all the way to 1.11 with relatively few issues. The way this works is all the things are only deprecated, not removed in the 1.x releases. So basically, if whenever they introduce something new, or whenever they try to replace something, the old thing will be kept around, and or otherwise implemented like using some compatibility layer. So another way to achieve stability without stagnation is the release for comment support process. So these are basically documents on GitHub that that whenever you want to make a major change in Ember, you're supposed to go through this channel and you describe the thing that you're trying to implement, some of the potential problems, and how you plan to address those issues. So this is a pretty good example. So recently, the core team submitted RFC for dropping IE 8 and 9 support. So the community weighed in, and then in the end, it's been determined that, well, it turns out that a lot of people still relies on IE 9. So the decision is that like IE 8 would be removed from Ember 2.0, but IE 9 would be kept around. So, having something like this makes it possible for the community to weigh in for major decisions before it's too late, and I guess it also makes the core team more comfortable about making these decisions. And these are some evidence of all the things that I just described working in the real world. So for example, this is some puppy user that upgraded from 1.7 to 1.10. And this is a list of some of the major features that shipped during the 1.x release cycle. And so as an example, as a recap, HTML bars shipped in Ember 1.10. So before HTML bars, so HTML bars is a new templating engine that replaces handlebars, which is what Ember used to use before 1.10. So this is what your templates look like before HTML bars. So it's basically some HTML stuff with some curlies with some dynamic stuff in there. So this is what your templates look like after HTML bars. It's basically some HTML with some curlies and some dynamic stuff there. You probably didn't notice the difference because there are no differences. So basically, they just dropped in a new templating engine. One of them are using string concatenation. One of them are actually DOM aware. So they are pretty fundamentally different under the hood. But I guess you can take comfort in that the core team takes a lot of time to make sure things work. And for the most part, you don't even care what that, like you don't even, as a user, you might not even be aware of what happened because you just upgrade your app and most of the apps use less memory and like maybe ran a little bit faster, but for the most part, as a user, you don't have to do a lot of work to get those improvements. And following that 1.10 release, this feature quote bound attributes were added in Ember 1.11, and this is what your template looks like before 1.11, and this is what your templates looks like after 1.11. You probably didn't notice any changes, and you're right because there are no changes. The difference is that when you run this code in your app, you will now get a deprecation warning telling you that, oh, this find attribute thing was a handlebars thing, and you don't really need to do that for HTML bars anymore. So you can improve it and make it look like this, which is a lot nicer, at least in my opinion. But then you don't actually have to, if you don't have time for it, you don't actually have to do this immediately because you know that find attributes is going to work for the remaining 1.x release. So as long as you do this sometimes before Ember 2.0, you're good. So to wrap up, let's quickly peek into the future. So once again, the JavaScript thought leader Yehuda has something to say about this. Eventually, all the good ideas will end up in Ember. You don't have to look very far for evidence. Again, this is the features that shipped during 1.x. And if you look closely, there's a thing called streams. If you heard about that reactive programming things that your cool JavaScript friends are raving about, then that's basically that. So it turns out that pattern were pretty useful and pretty helpful for implementing template binding. So the Ember team borrowed that idea and then refactor a lot of the low-level stuff with the reactive programming pattern. Another example is React. Yeah, so React is probably getting a lot of hypes lately, or not even so lately, but yeah. I use React sometimes. I found it pretty nice as well. But then, like I mentioned before, I have Ember projects, and unless I rewrite all of them in React and solve some of the old problems that I usually have and not have Ember CLI and stuff like that, it doesn't really help me. But fortunately, the core team spends a lot of time, look at things around their peripheries as well. And I think at some point, Yehuda mentioned that they seriously consider swapping like the real layer in Ember with like just implement it with React. So that didn't end up happening, but what came out of that exercise is something called Glimmer. If you want to read about it, you can read the RFC about, or actually you can read the pull requests. But yeah, we don't really have time to go into details, but basically that's like a new rendering engine that's heavily inspired by React that recently landed in the most recent beta. And what I want to point out is like this is a table of Yehuda comparing a lot of the React lifecycle hooks and they would reflect in the new post-Glimmer Ember Components API. The point of this is, as a user of the framework, you know that the team, the people who work on the team is well aware of what happens outside of like Ember, and they take time to carefully look at these things and digest them and bring them into Ember, which is great because over like in the long run you will get all the benefits of the actually useful things, and the framework that you're using will just consistently keep getting better and better over time, which is a very nice thing in the landscape of in the ever-changing landscape of JavaScript frameworks. So as I mentioned, it recently landed, and that's Glimmer. So coming in the future, there's Fastboot, which is basically server-side rendering for SEO purposes. There are one-way bindings, also heavily influenced by React's unique direction data flow philosophy. And then eventually there will be routable components, so like you just not have to worry about controllers and views and just use components everywhere. And there is this Ember 2.0 thing that people are talking about lately. You can read the RFC. But so let's look at Ember 2.0. So these are some features that are supposed to ship in the 1.x release, and this is the features that are supposed to ship with Ember 2.0. As you can see, there are no features because the plan is basically to just ship as much as possible in the 1.x release, and the purpose of the 2.0 or 2.0.0 release is basically just to remove all the deprecated things and remove all the compatibility layers and crops that end up slowing things down. Yeah, so I guess that's stability without stagnation. So that's pretty much, yeah, that's pretty much what I have prepared for you. And going back to this, I hope that you would have an answer to this for yourself after this, but I will basically let you decide for yourself. And yeah, so that's my thought. Thank you for sticking around.
Yeah. If checking code, so can you.
Yes, I forgot to say that. There you go.